I had booked a cozy little Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood for a weekend getaway with my girlfriend. It was a simple one-story house with a front porch and a small yard. The owners of the house, a friendly couple in their 50s, welcomed us and gave us a quick tour before leaving us to settle in. The first night was uneventful, and we both slept soundly in a comfortable bed. But on the second night, things started to get weird. We heard strange noises coming from the walls, like scratching and tapping sounds. It sounded like something was moving around inside the house. At first, we tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be an old house settling or the wind outside. But the noises grew louder and more persistent as the night went on. We started to feel uneasy, like something was watching us. In the middle of the night, we were both awoken by a loud bang. It sounded like something had fallen or been knocked over. We got out of bed and turned on the lights, but we couldn't find anything out of place. That's when we noticed a strange smell in the air, like burning hair or sulfur. We tried to go back to sleep, but we both felt like we were being watched. We heard footsteps moving around outside the bedroom door, and we could feel a presence in the room with us. It was like a cold and heavy weight pressing down on our chests. In the morning, we talked to the owners of the house about the strange occurrences. They seemed surprised and insisted that nothing like that had ever happened before. But as we packed up our things to leave, we noticed something strange on the back of the bedroom door. There were deep scratches and gouges, like someone or something had tried to claw their way through. We left the house feeling shaken and scared, but we decided to stay in the area for another day and explore the nearby town. We wandered through the quaint streets, admiring the old buildings and charming shops. As the sun began to set, we stumbled upon a small antique store. It was filled with all kinds of old and unusual items, from antique furniture to strange trinkets and jewelry. We browsed through the shelves, and my girlfriend picked up a small, intricately carved box. As she held it in her hands, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like someone was watching us, and I could hear the sound of whispers coming from somewhere in the store. My girlfriend felt it too, and she put the box back on the shelf quickly. We left the store and continued our walk through the town, but the feeling of unease stayed with us. As we made our way back to the Airbnb, we noticed that the sky had grown dark and stormy. When we arrived back at the house, we found that the power was out. We lit some candles and tried to settle in for the night, but the atmosphere in the house felt heavy and oppressive. The scratching and tapping sounds had returned, louder than ever. We huddled together on the couch, trying to ignore the feeling of dread in the pit of our stomachs. That's when we heard the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was dragging their feet along the floor. We froze, not daring to move or make a sound. The footsteps grew louder, until they stopped right outside the living room door. We could hear the sound of breathing, like someone or something was standing just on the other side of the door. I summoned up the courage to stand up and go to the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. We searched the house thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. We were alone, and yet we couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there with us. As the storm outside grew more intense, we huddled together, feeling more and more afraid. That's when we heard the sound of a woman's voice, singing softly in the darkness. We couldn't make out the words, but the melody was haunting and beautiful. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, echoing through the empty house. We called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no answer. The singing continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was like a siren's call, drawing us closer and closer to the edge of something dark and dangerous. As we listened, we began to hear other sounds too. The tapping of fingers on the window panes, the rustling of fabric, the creaking of old floorboards. It was like the whole house was alive, and it was trying to tell us something. We huddled together, feeling more and more afraid, until finally, we couldn't take it anymore. We grabbed our things and ran out of the house, into the pouring rain. As we drove away, we couldn't shake the feeling that we had just narrowly escaped something truly terrifying. The memory of the singing stayed with us, haunting us long after we had left that small, quiet house behind. I had been planning this weekend getaway for months. I needed a break from the stress and chaos of city life and wanted to escape to a peaceful, secluded place. When I found this cozy little cabin on Airbnb, it seemed like the perfect spot. It was tucked away in the woods surrounded by trees and nature, and promised to be a quiet and peaceful retreat. When I arrived, I was greeted by the host, who was a friendly and welcoming woman who showed me around the cabin. It was small, but it had everything I needed: a comfortable bed, a cozy fireplace, and a well-stocked kitchen. I spent the first day exploring the surrounding woods, reveling in the peace and tranquility of my surroundings. The air was fresh, the birds were singing, and everything felt perfect. But as the sun began to set, a feeling of unease crept over me. It was like something had shifted in the atmosphere, and the peaceful woods that I had been admiring just hours earlier suddenly seemed sinister and foreboding. As I prepared dinner, I heard strange noises outside the cabin, rustling in the bushes, the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves, and the occasional twig snapping. I tried to ignore it and tell myself that it was just an animal or a curious neighbor, but the noises continued throughout the night, growing louder and more ominous. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach, but I didn't want to overreact or seem paranoid. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the noises were just the sounds of nature. But as the night wore on, the noises grew more and more intense, and I couldn't deny that something was out there, lurking in the darkness. The feeling of being watched became overpowering, and I knew that I wasn't alone in the woods. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. As I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I heard the footsteps again, and this time unmistakably human. I froze with my heart pounding in my chest, and listened as the footsteps approached the cabin. I could hear someone breathing heavily, their breaths coming in short gasps, as if they were running or exerting themselves in some way. I tried to convince myself that it was just a lost hiker or a nearby neighbor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The footsteps grew louder, and I heard the sound of someone fumbling with the doorknob. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do next. I knew that I needed to call for help, but I didn't have my phone with me. I had left it charging in the kitchen, and now it was too late to get it. I locked the bedroom door and hid under the covers, praying that whatever was out there wouldn't find me. I stayed up all night, listening to the sounds of the forest and waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I packed my bags and left the cabin as quickly as possible, never looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of pure terror and helplessness that I experienced during my stay at that Airbnb. It was a nightmare that I hoped never to relive, and a reminder that not all escapes are what they seem. I always thought that renting out my cabin as an Airbnb was a great way to make some extra money. Little did I know that it would turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It started innocently enough. I had a couple book my cabin for a week-long stay in the mountains. They seemed like any other guests, polite and unassuming. But as the days went on, strange things started happening. I would come back to the cabin to find things moved around and items missing or broken. I tried to convince myself that it was just a case of forgetfulness or clumsiness on the part of the guests. But then I found the evidence that changed everything. Hidden in a drawer, I discovered a stack of fake IDs and passports. It was then that I realized that the couple staying at my cabin were not who they claimed to be. They were criminals on the run, using my cabin as a hideout. I was paralyzed with fear. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't call the police without risking my own safety. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own home, forced to wait for the couple to leave before I could take action. Days turned into weeks, and I watched as the couple went about their business, using my cabin as their own personal headquarters. They brought in other people, dangerous-looking men and women who seemed just as willing to commit crimes as the couple themselves. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, afraid to even leave my own property. Finally, the day came when the couple packed up their things and left. I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that I could finally report them to the authorities. But as I went through the cabin, I found even more evidence of their crimes. There were stolen items hidden in the attic and drugs hidden in the walls. I didn't know what to do. The police came and took everything away, but I was still left with the feeling that my life would never be the same. I was terrified that the criminals would come back for revenge, or that I would be targeted by their associates. I tried to go about my life as normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that followed me everywhere. I became paranoid, checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows. I even installed a security system, but it did little to ease my anxiety. The whole experience left me with a sense of distrust towards people. I couldn't believe that someone could be so evil, so willing to take advantage of someone else for their own gain. I vowed to never rent out my cabin again, and to be more careful about who I let into my life. To this day, I still have nightmares about that week. The sound of footsteps outside my window, the sight of strange cars parked on my street. I try to remind myself that I'm safe now that the criminals are behind bars. But the fear never truly goes away, and I know that I'll never forget what happened.